Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon is asking the U.S. Supreme Court to step in to prevent him from being sent to prison. Bannon was sentenced to 4 months behind bars for ignoring a subpoena issued by a congressional committee investigating the January 6th attack at the U.S. Capitol. The Hill national political reporter Cate Martel joins us to discuss. Kate, what happens now?
Yeah, Drew, I think it looks fairly likely that Steve Bannon is going to have to report to prison on July 1st. His last ditch attempt was actually that a federal appeals court on Thursday night decided not to continue delaying his prison sentence, and despite him continuing the legal avenues, that he still has to report to prison. So after that federal appeals court made that announcement, I would argue he had his last ditch request by going to the Supreme Court and is requesting them to step in. But everything that I'm hearing timing wise, it seems fairly unlikely, and it's kind of a long shot bid for him.
Yeah, is there any chance that the Supreme Court actually take this case? It strikes me that another former Trump official, Peter Navarro, is sitting in prison right now after he too was held in contempt of Congress and tried to appeal to the Supreme Court.
Exactly. I think it's a fairly long shot attempt. I think there is a chance, certainly, that the Supreme Court does take it. But it's also, from what I'm hearing, like you mentioned with Peter Navarro's case, that was fairly similar, and the Supreme Court flat out denied it. And even stepping back from the case itself, just the timing is tough because he has to report to prison by July 1st. The government, as the prosecution, has until Wednesday, June 26th to respond. They'll likely oppose it, so that only leaves a few days to the Supreme Court to handle it. So it is possible that they take it up, but from everything that I'm hearing, it sounds fairly unlikely.
And Kate, speaking of the U.S. Supreme Court, it has issued a ruling upholding a federal a federal law that banned suspects in domestic violence cases from possessing guns. The 8-1 opinion found that the law does not violate an expansion of the Second Amendment that the court approved 2 years ago. Wins for gun control advocates don't come often at this Supreme Court, and I'm wondering, is this one?
I would say yes, it is a win for people who are looking to regulate guns in any type of way. And it's a fascinating case if you're looking at the details of it, that it ended up being 8-1 in a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court. Only one justice, Justice Clarence Thomas, dissented, and all other 8 justices agreed that this was a fair exception. Now, the Supreme Court did expand on the Second Amendment protections a few years ago. So this was the question in looking at people who are have restraining orders against them because they're domestic abusers, and they thought that was a fair exemption. So they upheld this federal law, and that will continue to be considered constitutional. But overall, I would say this is a win for people who are looking to regulate guns in any type of way.
Now, besides for that ruling on gun rights, for now the court held off on issuing opinions on the most controversial cases before it: immunity for former President Trump, the fate of January 6 rioters, and several other issues were left undecided. What are you watching for as the Supreme Court wraps up this term?
Drew, when you start rattling off all of these major cases, all I can think of is that it's been a fairly leisurely run up to the end of the Supreme Court term. You always end up with a lot of major cases at the end, but this term has seemed particularly leisurely, and now there are a lot of major cases piled up. The 2 cases that I am watching for, number 1, are the emergency abortion case, and that is whether people who are pregnant that end up in the emergency room in an emergency situation in a state where abortion is illegal, what happens? That's the first major case. The second major case that I'm watching is former President Trump's immunity claim. That's one of the arguably the biggest case left that the Supreme Court has not ruled on. And there's been a lot of speculation on how the court will rule on this. But from court watchers that I've seen, the fact that it has been held up and will be waiting, or there will be an end to this case closer to July 1st, they might even have to delay it into July, that looks like it might be pointing to signs that it could be good for former President Trump. Even the former Attorney General Eric Holder, who worked in the Obama administration, said that he was concerned that there would be a disastrous result to this case. So from everything we're hearing, while we do not know the outcome, Drew, it does sound like the fact that the court is waiting until the very end, that it actually might end up being a pretty positive ruling for former President Trump.
And former President Trump is responding to a new law in Louisiana mandating that the Ten Commandments be displayed in every public school classroom across the state. Trump writing on social media that he loves the Ten Commandments and that it might be a first step in the revival of religion in the country. Now, this may please some religious conservatives, but the ACLU is promising a lawsuit. Hasn't the Supreme Court already said that this type of display is unconstitutional?
There have been similar cases where the court has considered this unconstitutional. And now, even before this bill was signed into law, there are already lawsuits that are already ready to go and are now taking shape. Now, even if the court does decide in future lawsuits that this is unconstitutional, I don't think it really matters for Republicans. It's still excellent fodder for Republicans, particularly former President Trump on the campaign trail. It certainly helps him with evangelical votes. And, you see the opponents are arguing that this erodes the line between the separation of church and state. But proponents of this law are also arguing that these are good morals all around. But you look at this case stepping back, and it is fairly controversial. It's actually mandating that all public schools from K to 12 plus public universities must display a poster-sized list of the Ten Commandments. So, while this likely will go through lawsuits over the next few years, it does bring up these questions of the separation of church and state in Louisiana. And that's why I think Republicans are arguing that even though this might be overreaching, depending on how the courts see it, that this could still help them on the campaign trail. And this can feed into what a lot of evangelical Christians would be hoping for in seeing the separation of church and state.
And also be interesting to see what this more conservative Supreme Court thinks of this issue. Republican Congressman Bob Good is promising to continue fighting with just a few hundred votes separating the incumbent from his challenger, John McGuire, in Virginia's 5th District Republican primary. The race is pitting key GOP factions against each other. Kate, give us an update on where this race stands and talk about the broader implications within the Republican primary.
This is so incredibly close, Drew, that the last I saw it this morning, they're only separated by a few tenths of a point. It's likely going to go to a recount. House Freedom Caucus Chair Bob Good has said that he will vow to have a recount, and he's also wants a full investigation into this. More broadly, this is, I think, the most fascinating race that I've seen in the primary election in 2024. Just considering Bob Good is fairly well known. He's the chair of the powerful House Freedom Caucus and has fairly high name recognition. And the reason why he is so close to potentially being ousted is because of beef he has with two very key Republicans. That's Donald Trump and former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Separate beef, Trump, it's the fact that he first endorsed Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in the primary, and with McCarthy, it's because he voted to oust him as Speaker last year. But both of these powerful Republicans were on the campaign trail trying to help Good's challenger, that's John McGuire, and he very well could win. And even though Bob Good could still win out of this primary, it's done a lot of damage to him. And broadly, this is showing me that Trump is really powerful in down ballot races. And if I'm a Republican in a tough race, I'm looking at this realizing, just how important it is to be aligned with Trump because of the power and the influence that he has in the Republican Party, not just at the top of the ticket, but also as it trickles down to some of these House and Senate races.
And we're gearing up for the first presidential debate next week when Biden and Trump face off Thursday in Atlanta. Trump is reportedly aware that Biden could outperform his expectations, that according to Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. Is there some recognition on Trump's part that back in 2020 he may have come into the debates a little overconfident?
Yeah, it's interesting reporting from Maggie Haberman that Trump is privately acknowledging that he might have set expectations too low for President Biden because, arguably the biggest campaign platform that Trump is running on is Biden's mental acuity, and arguing that his mental decline and age are something that should put Trump in the White House over Biden for a second term. So if you look next Thursday and Biden comes out swinging and seems energetic, has good answers to things, and he very well might. He's at Camp David already practicing over the next few days, that automatically is a win for Biden. And that has effectively lowered the expectations of Biden heading into this. So we're starting to see some of these Republicans try to recalibrate some of these expectations that they've set. And, as this plays out, Trump has also acknowledged that he interrupted Biden too many times in the first presidential debate of 2020. And that's something I'm going to be watching for to see, does he, how does he handle it this time? We do know that CNN has agreed with both campaigns to be able to mute the mics unless it's their time to be talking. So I expect fewer interruptions, but it's also going to be fascinating to see, because the Trump campaign has already set these expectations fairly low and are trying to recalibrate them with just a week out, that how does that define a win for both Trump and for President Biden?
Yeah, the style of this debate is definitely going to be different than we are used to seeing. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has filed a complaint with the Federal Elections Commission over his exclusion from that debate. Why was Kennedy denied a chance to be on that debate stage, and what, if any, recourse does he actually have?
Drew, is already arguably a long shot for RFK Jr. to make it onto the stage. He had already been scrambling to try to make it onto the debate based on some of the requirements. That's having, in 4 recent polls, at least 15% support, and being on enough ballots that it would be, literally possible for him to get 270 electoral college votes. Now, those are the requirements. He failed to make them, and he's arguing that the CNN is colluding with the Biden and the Trump campaigns and thinks this is unfair. And he's going to be filing a complaint with the Federal Election Committee. But, I would argue overall that the bigger fuss that RFK Jr. makes, the more attention that he gets, that maybe the higher name recognition could maybe get him on a debate stage later down the line. So while there were clear requirements for him to have to get on the debate, and he did not clear those in time and did not make it on the debate stage, it would have been a really big deal for him to be the third candidate on there. So, by filing this complaint, doesn't really matter how that complaint goes and whether or not that ends up being justified legally. But I think at the same time that the more that he can drag this out and the more attention that he can get, he would argue that just helps his name recognition and can help him at a time when he argues a lot of Americans are unhappy with the 2 options that they have on the debate stage currently.
Senator Ted Cruz has filed a bill to exempt tip wages from taxation. The move comes after Trump floated the idea during a rally in Nevada earlier this month. Now, this sounds a lot like election year politics, but some Republicans are actually balking at this proposal.
Yes, it does sure sound like election year politics, Drew. This is a proposal from Senator Ted Cruz that former President Trump thinks could help him with working class voters. This was a proposal that he first floated at a rally in Nevada and then followed up on Capitol Hill by discussing this with Republicans. And this is a proposal that did get a lot of immediate support from some Republicans on Capitol Hill, including Senator Rick Scott, and with the House companion bill, it got some support from some Republicans, but not all Republicans. They're not all in unison on this. Fiscal conservatives are skeptical of this proposal, and they argue it's going to add to the deficit. Over the next decade, they argue that it could actually add about $150 billion to up to $250 billion in deficit, and they'll have to make this up somehow by either tax cuts or finding taxes elsewhere. So this is something that Trump can certainly use on a campaign trail that might be able to help him politically, but at the same time, it's getting a lot of pushback from some fiscal conservatives and Democrats who are skeptical that it's even going to be able to pass in the House and the Senate. So overall, this is making a pretty fascinating debate over a bill that Senator Cruz just introduced.
And Trump saying he can do that right when he's the first elected is probably a long shot there. But popular drag performers are heading to Capitol Hill to promote LGBTQ rights. The performers will meet with members of Congress next week as part of Drag Lobby Day. Cate, what are the policies that they're promoting?
Yeah, it's going to be Drag Lobby Day on Tuesday, Drew, and what they're going to be advocating for are protections for LGBTQ people, and are going to be advocating for more protections because they argue some of the growing threats that they are facing in that community. There's specifically the Equality Act is something that a lot of these drag performers are going to be advocating for, and that's to add non-discrimination protections to people based on their gender identity and sexual orientation. So there have been a lot of celebrities on Capitol Hill over the past few weeks, and I expect Tuesday is going to be a very colorful day, and there's probably going to be a lot of cool imagery that we're going to be seeing coming out of this, because we're expecting some of the biggest drag performers in the industry to be on Capitol Hill and are going to try to make a splash while it is still Pride Month.
All right, Cate Martel, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Outgoing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte will be the next head of NATO. The news comes after his opponent, the president of Romania, bowed out. The Prime Minister will head the Western Security Alliance after being at his post for nearly 14 years. Rutte, nicknamed Teflon Mark, is a staunch critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin and a strong ally of Ukraine. NATO's strength has been tested in recent years. Former President Trump sent shockwaves across the alliance when he said recently that if reelected, he would not support NATO countries that do not pay enough in defense spending. The White House announcing that air defense missiles earmarked for other countries will now be sent to Ukraine. It comes as Ukrainian leaders have pleaded with the U.S. and other allies to send more weapons to defend against Russia. The White House says munitions for Taiwan and Israel will not be impacted, and the countries who ordered the weapons were notified that delivery would be delayed. Home sales are stalling as prices hit a record high in May. The spring is typically the busiest season for home buying, but the National Association of Realtors says this year they fell to a 30-year low. Elevated mortgage costs are factoring into the slump in sales, and the median listing nationwide during the month of May was over $419,000. A mortgage payment for that type of home is now more than double it was before the pandemic. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.